It was not yet a public spectacle. It was a funeral rite, a duty to the deceased that the Romans called munus. The blood was not meant for entertainment, but as an offering, not to the crowd, but to the spirits of the ancestors. Over time, however, what had been a private observance began to change. In the south of Italy, especially in Capua, these rites took on a new form. The Samnites, once enemies of Rome, had long staged warrior duels during feasts in honor of the dead. Gradually, death ceased to be the point. The struggle itself began to matter, the contest, the courage. Centuries later, the Christian writer Tertullian would say that bloodshed, once symbolic, came to amuse the living more and more. And so, what had been an offering turned into entertainment. By the end of the 2nd century before our era, these duels moved from funerals to festivals. No longer mourning ceremonies, but public games, ludi, held in honor of Jupiter, sometimes in times of crisis when the Senate sought the favor of the gods. Magistrates, especially aediles, saw in such spectacles a path to popularity. Blood became politics, and death a tool of influence. Temporary wooden arenas gave way to stone amphitheaters. What once took place in the mud was now paid for with public funds. The state took over the ritual, made it part of its culture, a law written not on tablets, but in stone. In time, the arenas filled with more than just gladiators. There appeared shows called venationes, hunts of wild beasts, and Damnatio ad Bestias, executions in which the condemned were thrown to lions and panthers. These displays were no longer about religious meaning, but about erasing the line between punishment and spectacle. The condemned, prisoners of war, sometimes rebels, all were sent into the arena. Hungry beasts sprang at them to the pleasure of the crowd. It was a brutal lesson in power and fear. When the crowd's murmur died, only the squeal of an iron gate could be heard. A man stepped onto the sand, alone, barefoot, with a short sword in his hand. Across from him, a lion emerged from a cage, gaunt, ribs showing terror in stone. In one find in Roman Britain, archaeologists uncovered a man's bones marked by deep bites matching a lion's jaws. This was no legend. It was a gladiator who truly died in combat. His wounds told their own story, of a man who faced a beast and fate. Seneca, writing in the 1st century of our era, noted that some prisoners chose to take their own lives before appearing in the arena rather than die for others' amusement. Their decision was a final act of freedom in a world that had stripped them of everything. What happened in the arena was not ordinary violence. It was carefully orchestrated degradation. The animals were starved to heighten the tension, to make the crowd hold its breath as a man confronted claws, fangs, and destiny. In Rome, law and spectacle walked hand in hand. The lion's roar was not just the sound of nature. It was the voice of power, fed and starved to serve the state. And so, every drop of blood spilled on the sand was like a signature beneath a new kind of law, the law of entertainment meant to teach domination. The arena became the place where a person faced not only the beast, but fate itself. And the crowd, both bored and inflamed, watched in silence, waiting for the final blow. On the arenas, punishment and entertainment stopped being separate. Costumes, sets, and props changed, but the meaning stayed the same. The crowd was meant to hold its breath, then erupt when a man fell beneath an animal's claws or an opponent's blade. At first, these shows were billed as hunts, venationes, ordinary chases brought into the city. But within the amphitheater walls, everything sharpened. Panthers from Nubia, lions from Africa, bears from the mountains were released. They had been starved beforehand, so their movements were violent and their strikes certain. This was not nature. It was a construction, carefully planned so the drama swelled with every step of the beast and every retreat of the human. Damnatio ad Bestias sounded like a sentence because it was one. The condemned, prisoners of war, rebels, and anyone the state wished to humiliate were led onto the sand with no hope of return. The crowd loved that certainty. It expected blood to restore provinces. Archaeologists found bones gouged by deep fang marks. Each cut said the same thing. Here a man faced a beast and lost. Philosophers recorded the arena's whisper in another language. They wrote that some condemned chose death before the show, so that at least at the end they could decide for themselves. For the authorities, it was a problem. For the crowd, a disappointment. For those people, a last freedom. Thus, a peculiar ethics of the spectator was born. The crowd condemned cowardice, rewarded courage with applause, but loved most of all the finale, where fate closed with a single blow. As the spectacles grew, so did the power of officials. Aediles competed for the crowd's favor. Who would bring more animals? Who would surprise with a new scene? Who would show something the city would talk about? Wooden structures grew larger, then vanished, replaced by stone that promised permanence. The amphitheater was no longer a temporary place. It became a machine for producing emotion, set in the city's heart like a mechanism in a clock. In the same way, battles on water were born. Now Machiae, not on the sea, not in a harbor, but in artificial basins, dug and fed by an aqueduct, so a naval battle could unfold in the middle of the city. First they decided that if they could direct the crowd, they could direct water. They dug a pool, lined the banks, built the stands. Then they let in the ships, real ones, heavy, with oars slapping the surface. On the decks stood people condemned to play at war, with no reshuffle, no escape. For them, it was no pageant. For them, every order was a sentence. The first great flourish came with a leader who knew how to command both armies and imagination. In the 46th year before the birth of Christ, a great basin was dug by the riverbank. 2 fleets were to meet there, as if history could be told once more, louder, closer, within arm's reach. Stands rose in the sand around it. The chill of stone settled as people took their seats in rows. Then the drums began. Horns split the air. The water shivered. The boats drove at each other, and spray flew up, as if the city itself were breathing with those who were about to die on the decks. After him came a ruler who what had truly been said, and what was repeated only because it sounded stronger. Yet even if the words swelled with pathos, ships truly sank, and people truly bled. When the great amphitheater opened under a ruler famed for generosity, water games became the emblem of imperial splendor. It was said that a nearby basin was used to stage a battle, then a hunt and races. For several days, the city lived on nothing else. On the first day, thousands of beasts were slain. On the second, horses carried riders through dust and thunder. On the third, boats locked sterns, and then infantry stormed a man-made island at the center of the water. All of it to make everyone understand that power could conduct even war like a melody. Sometimes water was brought into the arena itself. The sand was flooded until it vanished under a bright skin, and in that shallow mirror, miniature battles played out. The crowd saw it and did not ask how it was done. It was enough that it could be done. Technique in the service of awe, scenography in the service of obedience, and always the same message. If the course of water can be shifted, so can the course of a life. At noon, when the sun stood still over the stone, there came something stranger still. Between the morning fights and the afternoon contests, the intermission was filled with staged myths. They were not innocent tableaux. They were stories of blood and fire. A singer stepped onto the sand to charm animals like in the legend. But the bear did not heed the song.
At the signal, it tore the man apart. On another day, someone rose on wings of wax and feathers. The arena tolerated no delusions. He fell and died under fangs. The irony cut sharper than a sword. How dearly would you long for your feathers now? There was also the myth of a queen cursed with desire for a bull. Spectators watched as a woman, or a condemned man in a woman's dress, was thrown to the beast. The line between story, punishment, and voyeurism blurred like paint on heated stone. Fire had its part here too. The condemned were dressed in tar-soaked tunics and set alight. Sometimes it was said to be a scene of an ancient hero proved
because they had seen that cruelty could be elegantly packaged and violence smoothly choreographed. At noon, the arena turned into a theater of myths. Stories known from songs and statues were performed live, without mercy and without illusion. A singer would appear, meant to tame nature like a hero from an old legend. Gentle animals were loosed around him, as if the world would bow to music for a moment. Then a roused bear would charge in and tear the performer apart, ending the show with a scream and a hush just before the applause. In another scene, someone tried to rise like an inventor on wings of feathers and wax. In the arena, wings did not work. He fell straight into the fangs, and a jeering punchline hung in the air like a warning. How dearly would you long for your feathers now? There were also spectacles that reenacted a queen's cursed desire for a bull, turning myth into a show, and a human being into the instrument of someone else's curiosity. These scenes were not allegory, they were executions in costume. Contemporary accounts spoke plainly of cruel reinterpretations, of a singer torn apart by a bear, of a figure mockingly paired with the winged inventor, of a staged violation meant to shock more than any sword. Fire had its own role. The condemned were dressed in tar-soaked tunics and set alight, made to imitate ancient models of courage, as if flame could be a moral lesson and fire a commentary on virtue. At noon, when the audience expected respite, it was announced that a little blood was needed to keep things moving, and people were thrown to certain death without armor, without a shield, so that no blow could glance off and the end would be quick, visible, inevitable. Philosophers warned against the crowd. Among many, it is easy to take on their habits, and easier still to come home more greedy, more ambitious, inflamed, and even inhuman, because one has seen violence turned into pleasure, and cruelty into a way to pass the time. Rome also learned to stage battles on water, the way it directed crowds. Great basins were dug and fed by aqueducts so that naval wars could be fought in the city's heart. In one of the most famous pools, the length and width measured 1,800 and 1,000 was celebrated with a naumachia, and at the battle signal a cry rang out that entered memory, though its authenticity is disputed. Those who are about to die salute you. At another moment, during the inauguration of a great amphitheater, myths were turned into bloody tableaux, and the poet who described those days recorded scenes that still sound like an indictment. A spread-eagled, condemned man yielding his body to a beast. A singer torn by a bear. The winged hero summoned with a sneer. And a brutal staging of a queen's cursed desire. Thus memory was built, from the scream, the smoke, and the echo of a horn cutting through stone stands. On sand, on water, and in flames, the arenas taught one lesson. Violence can be framed as ceremony, and ceremony can become a tool of rule. Officials competed for favor, senators tended to the gods' goodwill, and emperors showed they could command both the crowd and the elements. The beast's hunger, the slide of oars, the hiss of torches, this was the language of the state. Spectacle hardened into law, not carved on tablets, but in stone and in the audience's memory.
When the crowd left the seats, something inside shifted. They went home more aroused, more hungry, more hard, because they had spent a day among people and yet learned from beasts. So ends the tale of how ritual became politics and performance a method of dominion. Blood on the sand, water in the basins, and the fire of torches formed the alphabet with which power wrote its message. And the question that remains still asks, which spectacle best revealed that power? The funerary contests, the beast hunts, the battles on water, or the mythic tortures? Each repeated the same line. In Rome, life was a material to be worked, and the arenas were the tools that gave it shape.